Well, here we are. I didn't really plan on starting this channel on a House of the Dragon review, but I wound up with the virus of unknown origin about which we're not allowed to comment upon, and so things were delayed. So this Sunday came around, and House of the Dragon was on, and I figured since my plans went all to hell, why not? To preface, I am a complete normie on Game of Thrones. I never read the books, watched any full episodes, watched any but the most hilarious of condemnations of what the clowns running Game of Thrones Season 8 did to what had been a great show before they ran out of Martin's material in an era where cultural phenomena entertainment was more and more rare. Everyone seemed to watch Game of Thrones, and it was one of the few times I was on the outside looking in where genre entertainment is concerned. Star Wars, Star Trek, Lord of the Rings, and even franchises like Predator, Terminator, and Aliens were decades-long favorites of mine before most of them were destroyed by cultural vandals, too stupid to know what they were doing or too malicious to care. Even things like Battlestar Galactica or Doctor Who were things I had either seen old iterations of or watched whole episodes of newer iterations. All of that to say, I kind of came into House of the Dragon about as much of a normie as I would on most other genre shows or movies. I knew the broad outline of Game of Thrones and saw maybe a total accumulation of scenes from various episodes to make an entire hour's worth, but I doubt it. So imagine my surprise when I sat down on Sunday to watch what I was expecting to be yet another genre dumpster fire pumped out by the activists Hollywood keeps hiring to run their entertainment into the ground. It didn't completely suck. Don't get me wrong, it didn't completely blow me away either. But instead of completely running through the episode step by step, let's keep this spoiler free and start with what did not really work for me. First thing I want to get out of the way is the elephant in the room with this show compared to what I know of the original, race. George R.R. Martin, contrary to many who write for Hollywood these days, wrote his stories in such a fashion as to make sense in a medieval world where travel for any distance, sans dragon, was arduous. As such, most people were born, lived, and died within a pretty small radius of their birthplace. Mass immigration was not really a thing, and when it was greeted with war, often to the point of genocide. All of that is a long-winded way to say that not only did racial groups tend to live somewhat isolated from one another, but within those racial groups, ethnically and culturally differentiated groups lived separate. Germans lived with Germans, Celts lived with Celts, Arabs lived with Arabs, Persians lived with Persians, Chinese lived with Chinese, and so forth and so on. The exceptions being merchants, pilgrims, missionaries, refugees, and emissaries, of course. The original Games of Thrones took this into account, and where there were exceptions to this, like Khal Drogo or Grey Worm, their presence away from the lands their people dwell within is explained. Leader of a conquering horde for Khal Drogo, and an unsullied bought by Daenerys for Grey Worm. One of my worries going into the House of the Dragon was the showrunners and cast were explicit in reveling in such concerns being thrown out the window. And given how very, very pale the Targaryens are, some of the palest people in Martin's world, practically albinos, this seemed particularly stupid. If they were going to throw a bunch of ethnic minorities into a setting populated by extremely pale people in Game of Thrones, then how are they going to explain what happened in the intervening years, and would it rhyme with Holocaust or ethnic blensing or Benocide? And while it was mildly jarring to see Steve Toussaint as Lord Corlys Velaryon, especially given he is extremely not pale and rocking pale white dreads, his children as well, his part is played well in this episode, limited as it was. I mention this first because I get the feeling from the promotional efforts Warner put out to hype House of the Dragon that this will be prevalent going forward, which I think is a shame. Rather than use some creativity and craft stories to fit what you want to see on screen, the lazy use of tokenism is substituted. However, thus far it is not jarring enough to jolt me out of the immersive feeling of the show. The second worry going into House of the Dragon, and the more pressing given how hard Warner Brothers pushed it in the media leading up to the show, was the rabidly feminist slant a number of the people put forth for interviews leaned into, especially Olivia Cooke, who plays the older Lady Alicent Hightower, the companion to the older Princess Rhaenyra, and they start hitting you over the head with that very early in the first episode, with the first scenes between the princess and Queen Aemma Arryn. The promos for the show have Olivia Cooke, Emma Darcy, and Eve Best, who plays Princess Rhaenys, the queen that never was Targaryen, talking about how the men were tearing the kingdom apart. If a woman was ruler, then everything would be fine. However, they seem to completely miss that it is Alicent Hightower and Rhaenys Targaryen tearing the kingdom apart in their own avarice and ambition. Maybe future episodes will show differently, but the promos were pretty clear that the only male mucking things up was Matt Smith's Prince Daemon. Everyone else jockeying for power was female. The feminism, when present, was heavy-handed and not overly well acted. That could be the fault of the writers, but Hollywood lost any benefit of the doubt long ago when it comes to their political pandering. The final problem with the first episode was the appalling CGI dragons. The dragon effects in Season 1 of Game of Thrones was far better, and by the time the dragons grow up into their adult forms, the difference between House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones is laughable. I'm not sure how Hollywood has managed it, but their technology actually seems to be going in reverse as far as quality is concerned. At first, I thought I was imagining it, so I went and found a collection of scenes from the original series to compare with what I had watched, and I was definitely not imagining it. The aerial shot to open the show and the cityscape shots were all fairly well done, but that dragon Princess Rhaenyra was riding was complete crap. It looked worse than the original Jurassic Park dinosaurs created over a quarter of a century ago by Industrial Light and Magic. Alright, that is the bad stuff out of the way, so what did they get right? First off, some of the performances were just spectacular. Matt Smith was Matt Smithing all over my screen, as one would expect of the 11th Doctor. He was brutal and brooding and completely mesmerizing as Prince Daemon. The only problem I had with his scenes was that he is billed as the best warrior in the land, and yet that is shown in less than convincing fashion. Without getting specific, one would have expected the scene to go very differently than it did if he was the greatest warrior of Westeros, especially given how the scene went. That aside, Smith was superb. As was Paddy Considine, if in the other direction. He portrayed King Viserys Targaryen as the very picture of a weak king holding on to his throne by his fingertips, while those around him battled each other in the very picture of Machiavellianism. Considine was at his best as the king, especially during the tournament sequence. Rhys Ifans and Emily Carey were both standouts in their roles as the very Machiavellian Ser Otto Hightower, hand of the king and political rival of Prince Daemon, and his daughter Alicent, companion of Princess Rhaenyra. Ifans played the sleazy politician very well, and Carey did an excellent job portraying the younger version of his daughter. There is one scene in particular that shows exactly how far he is willing to go to secure the power he has, and it is played to the hilt by both. Now, I forgot one thing that did stick out as rather less than stellar, and I guess this is the better place to put it rather than lump it in with the other more political and technical side of things. Millie Alcock as the younger version of Princess Rhaenyra. Her performance was wooden and emotionless for the most part throughout the first episode. There were glimpses here and there of what probably got her the role, but overall she was less than convincing in most scenes. Now, giving her the benefit of the doubt, I might suggest she was told to play her role like a sociopath to set up Emma Darcy, who plays the older version of Rhaenyra. If so, then I will, of course, mention that when Emma Darcy takes over the role. For now, however, she was one of the more jarring parts of the first episode, with little affect when she should be emoting, and when she was emoting, it was restrained and incongruent with the scene. I'm hoping her performance loosens up before Darcy takes over the older version of the character, but I'm not optimistic given what I saw in the first episode. I won't go whole hog in dishing out my praises for episode 1 of House of the Dragon. It was not a waste of time. The writing, when real-world politics was not getting in the way, was solid. The cinematography was spectacular often. Many of the performances were exceptional. It was fantasy done well and with a realistic brutality that I heard was very much present in the original series. However, if the CGI is as bad with the rest of the show as it was in the first episode, and if real-world politics intrudes even more into the show in follow-on episodes, I can see this show living or dying on the performances by Considine, Smith, and Iphans. The writing is simply not good enough to survive the jarring tones that shake the immersive feeling that is the goal of all good television and movies. And if the show should go on long enough to outstrip whatever George R.R. Martin has written in Fire and Blood, the show could collapse much like the original, going up in flames like Season 8 for Game of Thrones. The people running these shows are simply not talented enough to improvise, as was shown in Season 8. If you plan to watch House of the Dragons, go into it remembering it is current year Hollywood and they can't help themselves. So far, that means a few annoying patches and an overall decent opening episode, I guess. Well, that, my little heathens, is all for now. I'll be back with episode 2 next week. I'll be back next week with episode 2, and thanks for clicking on a Munchausen's Proxy, brought to you by the Social Misanthrope. That's all for now. Bye.